July 8, 1944, Ravensbrück concentration camp, Germany. The dawn light is cold and colorless. In the courtyard, 3 young women stand in silence facing a wall that has already witnessed too much death. One of them, Violette Szabo, age 23, clenches her fists, her lips trembling not in fear but in defiance. Only a few years earlier, she'd been a shopgirl in London, a wife and a mother. Now she's a condemned spy, sentenced to die for the simple act of fighting for freedom. The German officer raises his hand. The rifle's level. For a brief second, she closes her eyes, perhaps remembering her daughter's face, perhaps thinking of France, the land she loved enough to die for. The shots echo, and silence returns. But Violette Szabo was not alone. Across occupied Europe, hundreds of women, ordinary citizens turned secret agents, had stepped into a world of shadows. They smuggled weapons through forests, tapped out Morse code messages beneath Nazi noses, and carried death warrants disguised as love letters. Among them was Noor Inayat, a gentle soul and musician turned radio operator, the spy princess who refused to reveal a single name, even under brutal Gestapo torture. And Nancy Wake, the White Mouse, whose courage was so legendary that the Gestapo placed a 5 million franc bounty on her head. They were mothers, poets, lovers, and soldiers of the unseen war. This is their story, of courage that defied terror, of silence that spoke louder than screams, and of the brutal fate that awaited the women spies of World War II. In 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. Europe lay under Hitler's boot, and the Nazi swastika fluttered from the Eiffel Tower to the Baltic Sea. Winston Churchill, desperate to strike back, founded a secret organization that would set Europe ablaze. It was called the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. Its agents were trained to blow up bridges, sabotage rail lines, gather intelligence, and ignite resistance inside occupied territories. And among its most daring recruits were women. At first, even within British intelligence, the idea of female spies was dismissed. Women, they said, were too fragile, too emotional. But soon the SOE realized the opposite was true. A woman could move unnoticed through checkpoints, ride a bicycle past German soldiers, or carry coded notes hidden in lipstick tubes. Courage came in many forms, and the most unassuming faces often hid the fiercest resolve. One such face belonged to Violette Szabo. She was 22, half French, half British, working in a London store when war came to her doorstep. Her husband, Etienne Szabo, a French Foreign Legion officer, was killed in North Africa. Grief did not break her, it hardened her. When the SOE approached her, she volunteered without hesitation. "I want to do something for him," she said simply. Training was brutal. In the secluded estates of southern England, recruits learned to fire Sten guns, kill silently, read maps in the dark, and send coded messages through crackling radio sets. Instructors tried to break her spirit with exhaustion and mock interrogations, but Violette laughed in their faces. Her file described her as fearless and possessed of exceptional spirit. By 1944, the Allies were preparing for D-Day. France needed chaos, and Violette was sent to create it. Under the code name Louise, she parachuted into occupied France under the cover of night. The drop zone near Limoges shimmered with moonlight as her parachute opened, landing her behind enemy lines with a small case of weapons, maps, and hope. Her mission was simple in plan, impossible in execution: to coordinate sabotage operations that would cripple Nazi communication lines before the Allied landings. She met with local resistance fighters, passed coded messages, and organized ambushes. Her fluency in French and calm demeanor made her a natural leader. No one suspected that the charming young woman at the cafe carried orders that could change the war. But in June 1944, fate turned. German patrols had intensified after the D-Day invasion. A roadblock near Limoges caught her traveling with another agent. Her vehicle was stopped. The papers, forged, did not convince the soldiers. Violette knew what capture meant. The Gestapo's prisons were not places of survival. But she refused to run. Instead, she grabbed a Sten gun and fired until the barrel burned. Witnesses later said she fought until the last bullet. When captured, she was bleeding, bruised, but unbroken. They took her to Frayne prison near Paris. The interrogations began. long, merciless sessions meant to destroy her will. The Gestapo demanded names, locations, codes. She gave them nothing. When they shouted threats, she stared back in silence. When they struck her, she smiled. In one report, a German officer wrote, "The prisoner Szabo remains insolent and defiant. She refuses to cooperate in any way. She seems to laugh at her fate." Weeks passed. Her body weakened, but her resolve only grew stronger. Fellow prisoners would later recall her comforting them in whispers through cell walls, telling them to hold on, freedom is coming. She was eventually transferred to Ravensbrück, the notorious concentration camp for women. But her story was only one among many. Dozens of female agents had already vanished into the same darkness. At this point in history, the SOE had sent 39 women into occupied France. 13 never returned. Their bravery was a secret weapon, and their suffering, a hidden tragedy. Violette Szabo's courage was about more than patriotism. It was about love, for her husband, for her daughter, and for a world free from tyranny. As the war raged on, her silence under torture became legend among Allied agents. They would later say that she was the embodiment of Churchill's call, "Never surrender." But as her story faded behind the prison walls of Ravensbrück, another woman stepped into the spotlight, a gentle, soft-spoken daughter of an Indian Sufi prince. Her weapon was not a gun but a radio transmitter. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan, and her courage would soon defy the Gestapo in ways they could never imagine. In the summer of 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, far away from the sound of liberation, a woman sat in a dark cell in Ravensbrück. Her name was Violette Szabo, and she had become the Gestapo's favorite target, not because she talked, but because she wouldn't. Inside the prison, silence was a form of rebellion. Every time she refused to speak, she denied the Nazis control. They starved her, beat her, dragged her through endless interrogations. Yet every blow met the same answer: nothing. Another inmate later recalled seeing her being forced to carry heavy stones until she collapsed. When the guards laughed, she stood again and smiled through the blood on her lips. "They can break my body," she whispered, "but not my soul." By early 1945, her body had become frail, but her spirit unyielding. On February 5, 1945, in the frozen morning air, Violette Szabo was led to a courtyard along with two other female agents, Lillian Rolf and Denise Bloch. There was no trial, no ceremony, no mercy. The women stood side by side. When the SS officer raised his pistol, Violette looked straight ahead. A single gunshot ended her life, but her courage outlived her captors. Her ashes were scattered with thousands of others. No grave bears her name, yet her legacy was carved into history. The young mother who defied an empire of fear. But Violette was not the only one to suffer for silence. Hundreds of miles away, another agent had already become the Gestapo's most hunted prey. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan, and she was unlike any spy the world had ever seen. Born in Moscow in 1914 to an Indian Sufi father and an American mother, Noor was raised in a household filled with music, poetry, and peace. She studied harp at the Paris Conservatoire and wrote children's stories before war shattered her world. When the Nazis invaded France, Noor fled to Britain and joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Her gentle nature didn't hide her quiet resolve. She soon volunteered for the SOE, trained as a radio operator, the most dangerous role in the resistance. Codenamed Madeleine, Noor was sent back into occupied France in June 1943, the first female wireless operator the SOE had ever sent. Operating a radio in Paris was a death sentence. The Gestapo could trace signals within minutes, and radio operators were considered top priority targets. Yet for 4 long months, Noor transmitted messages across occupied France, coordinating supply drops, sabotage missions, and resistance movements. Every night she carried her radio through the streets of Paris in a heavy suitcase, pretending to be a student or a seamstress. When Gestapo patrols approached, she smiled politely and disappeared into the crowd. Her courage amazed even hardened resistance fighters. She was always calm, always kind, yet she lived every day knowing that discovery meant torture and death. Then came betrayal. A double agent revealed her location. In October 1943, Gestapo officers surrounded her safe house. She tried to escape across the rooftops but was overpowered and arrested. Her code books, her radio, her life's work, and all confiscated. Her nightmare had begun. At Avenue Foch, the Gestapo headquarters in Paris, she endured interrogation after interrogation. They beat her with rifle butts, chained her hands and feet, threatened her with execution. But Noor, the quiet poet, refused to speak. She gave no names, no codes, no secrets. Her captors couldn't believe it. "She is dangerous," one Gestapo officer wrote. "She is made of steel." After repeated escape attempt, including one nearly successful break from her cell roof, she was labeled highly dangerous and shipped to Pforzheim prison in Germany. There she was kept in complete isolation. No sunlight, no voice, no human contact, for 10 months. The guards would beat her when she tried to speak, yet she still whispered messages of hope to nearby prisoners. Her spirit glowed like a candle in a cave. In September 1944, with the war nearing its end, the Gestapo transferred Noor and 3 other female SOE agents to Dachau concentration camp. On September 13th, at dawn she was taken to an execution ground. Her final word was one that stunned even the SS officer. Liberté. Freedom. She was shot at close range. Her body was never recovered. In London, her fellow agents wept when the news arrived months later. The quiet woman they once called too gentle for war had died with a defiance that shook her enemies. Noor Inayat Khan was posthumously awarded the George Cross and the Croix de Guerre, one of the highest honors for bravery. Her radio silence had been louder than betrayal. As the Allies pushed through France, one more name emerged. A woman who refused to die, who turned the Gestapo's manhunt into humiliation. Her name was Nancy Wake, and to the Nazis, France 1943. The Gestapo had a name whispered with hatred, Nancy Wake. Posters of her face hung in German outposts. Warnings printed in bold, the White Mouse, dead or alive. So elusive was she that every time they closed in, she slipped away, silent, cunning, unstoppable. Born in New Zealand in 1912 and raised in Australia, Nancy Wake was a journalist before the war. She saw the rise of fascism firsthand while reporting from Vienna, and knew evil when she saw it. By the time German troops marched into France, she had married a wealthy French industrialist, Henri Fiocca, and joined the resistance without hesitation. Her charm, intelligence, and audacity made her invaluable. Nancy became a courier for the Marseille escape network, smuggling downed Allied pilots forged papers and supplies across Nazi checkpoints. Her success earned her the nickname the White Mouse, because no matter how many traps the Gestapo set, she always escaped. But espionage is a game played against time, and time was running out. In 1943, the Gestapo closed in on her network. To protect her husband and her identity, she fled France, traveling through Spain and finally reaching Britain, where she joined the SOE. There, she underwent the same grueling training as male agents: hand-to-hand combat, demolition, sabotage. Her instructors called her a natural-born killer. When asked how she felt about killing Nazis, she replied coldly, "They were beasts." "I didn't feel anything except that I was doing my job." By April 1944, Nancy parachuted back into France, deep behind enemy lines. She landed in the forests of Auvergne, part of the Maquis resistance tasked with preparing the region for D-Day. From the moment she hit the ground, she took command. Her first act? Cycling over 300 kilometers through enemy territory to re-establish a broken communications line, carrying vital codes that would ensure the success of Allied airdrops. She rode day and night, hiding in ditches when patrols passed, surviving on berries and courage. When she returned, her comrades could hardly believe she was alive. Nancy became the heart of the resistance in central France. She organized ambushes, coordinated supply drops, and directed sabotage missions that crippled Nazi transport routes. Her fearlessness inspired men twice her size to follow her orders without question. One of her comrades later said, "She could drink us all under the table, fight like 10 men, and still look like a movie star doing it." But war doesn't forgive bravery. The Gestapo never stopped hunting her. They raided villages, interrogated locals, tortured suspected allies. When they couldn't catch Nancy, they turned to her husband Henri. He refused to betray her and unpaid with his life. She would only learn of his death after the war. It broke her heart, but not her resolve. In June 1944, the Germans launched a massive counter-offensive against resistant strongholds in central France. Nancy led her fighters through ambushes and chaotic retreats, outsmarting the enemy at every turn. During one battle, when a convoy ran out of ammunition, she personally cycled 20 kilometers under fire to retrieve more. Her men called her Madame Fioca, the woman who refused to die. By the time Allied forces liberated France, Nancy Wake had become a legend. She was one of the Gestapo's most wanted women, with a 5 million franc bounty on her head. Yet she had survived every hunt, every raid, every shadow that tried to claim her. After the war, when asked how she endured it all, Nancy gave a small smile and said, "You can't think about fear, you just get on with it." Nancy Wake's story stood in haunting contrast to the fates of Violette Szabo and Noor Inayat. Where they were captured, tortured, and executed, Nancy lived to see the sun rise over a liberated France. But survival came at a cost: the loss of friends, the loss of her husband, and the memories that never faded. She was awarded the George Medal, the Medal of Freedom, and 3 times the Croix de Guerre. Yet she often said the medals meant little compared to the faces she'd lost. Still, her name became immortal and a living echo of those who didn't return. 3 women, 3 fates. 1 war that tested the limits of courage. Violette died defiant. Noor died silent. Nancy survived, but never stopped mourning the others. The war ended, but the silence remained. A silence that history would only later fill with recognition. As Europe celebrated victory, the stories of these women were buried under medals, politics, and fading memories. Yet their courage refused to disappear. They had fought in shadow so that others could live in light. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, millions celebrated freedom. Flags waved, streets filled with music, soldiers kissed strangers. But in the ruins of the continent, another kind of silence lingered. The silence of those who never returned. Among them were the female agents of the Special Operations Executive, women who had fought in the dark so that victory could shine in daylight. For years, their stories were hidden in classified files, labeled top secret. It would take decades before the world learned what really happened to them inside the walls of Nazi prisons. At Ravensbrück, the all-female concentration camp north of Berlin, more than 130,000 women were imprisoned, political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, and spies. They were stripped, shaved, starved, and worked to exhaustion. Many were used for medical experiments. Few left alive. This was where Violette Szabo met her end. The Gestapo had wanted to make an example of her, to show what happened when women dared to defy them. But instead, they created a martyr. The prisoners who survived remembered her smile, her whispered encouragements, her unbroken will. She was light, one woman later said, in a place made only of darkness. At Dachau, where Noor Inayat spent her last hours, SS guards led her to an execution yard at dawn. Witnesses said she was beaten so severely she could barely stand. Yet when the officer asked for her final words, she lifted her head and said softly, "Liberté," freedom. Even dying, she refused to surrender the word the Nazis feared most. These women didn't have rifles or armies. Their weapons were codes, courage, and conviction. They fought an invisible war, one that depended on silence and sacrifice. Meanwhile, Nancy Wake lived, but her survival came with ghosts. After the liberation of France, she learned the truth she had always feared. Her husband, Henri Fioca, had been captured by the Gestapo and executed for refusing to betray her. The news crushed her. For years, she couldn't speak of him without tears. She had survived countless ambushes, bombings, and raids, but the thought that Henri had died because of her haunted her more than any battle. In her later years, Nancy often said she had never truly escaped the war. "I only stopped fighting when the Nazis were gone," she once told a journalist. "But they took a piece of me with them." Yet she lived a long life, outspoken, fiercely independent, and unrepentant about her choices. When someone once asked if she regretted killing Germans, she replied without hesitation, "Not for a moment." They deserved everything they got. The Gestapo, who once believed that fear could conquer will, were proven wrong. In every interrogation room, every locked cell, and every silent courtyard, these women turned fear into defiance. Their stories revealed that courage has no gender, and that even in the darkest places, the human spirit refuses to break. The war ended, but its scars remained written in history and in the memories of those who survived. In 1946, the world began to honor them. Violette Szabo was posthumously awarded the George Cross and the Croix de Guerre. Noor Inayat Khan received the George Cross, and memorials to her bravery now stand in both London and Paris. Nancy Wake received more decorations than any other Allied woman, yet she always said, "The real heroes are the ones who never came back." In time, books were written, documentaries filmed, and their faces appeared on memorials and stamps. But no monument, no medal can ever capture the true weight of what they endured. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for people, for their homes, for strangers, for a future they would never see. Every coded message they sent carried not just intelligence, but hope. Every step across enemy lines was a gamble against death. And when the Gestapo finally caught them, their silence screamed louder than any confession. Today, when we walk through peaceful European cities, Paris, London, Berlin, their shadows still linger between the cobblestones, the cafe tables where they once met their contacts, the train stations where they slipped into disguise, the forest where they parachuted through moonlight. All still whisper their names. Violette, Noor, Nancy. 3 women who proved that bravery doesn't always carry a gun. Sometimes, it carries a radio, a forged passport, and an unbreakable will. Their fates remind us that freedom has always come at an unthinkable cost, and that sometimes the strongest warriors in history were those who fought with silence, courage, and love. In the end, history remembers the battles, the generals, the flags of victory. But what it often forgets are the whispers, the messages sent in code, the courage hidden behind false names, the women who fought not for medals but for meaning. Violette Szabo, Noor Inayat Khan, Nancy Wake. 3 women who looked the enemy in the eye and never blinked. They were not soldiers in uniform. They were ordinary souls, mothers, writers, wives, who carried extraordinary strength. When captured, they endured the unthinkable. When tortured, they stayed silent. And when death came, they faced it with dignity that shamed their executioners. Their stories remind us that freedom isn't built only by those who fire the bullets, but also by those who refuse to break. Today, their names are etched into memorials, carved into medals, remembered in films and books. But their true monument lies elsewhere, in every act of courage born from quiet resistance, in every voice that stands against tyranny.